Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar series on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC program. My name is Micah Dolan, and I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer here at ATI. The purpose of this series is to provide innovators, specifically non-traditional defense contractors, with the knowledge and tools to navigate the CMMC program. We have partnered with Cuick Trac to support this series, but you'll be hearing from different vendors and experts throughout the program. While some of these vendors may have solutions or services that may assist your company, we are simply providing information, not endorsing one solution or vendor over any others. As you'll hear throughout this series, the needs and structure of your company dictate the steps and the complexity of your CMMC journey. Unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all, nor a one-price-fits-all answer. I'll offer that CMMC and cybersecurity requirements aren't something we can ignore, and it's incumbent that industry be able to apply practical solutions. We know that the government needs you, the innovators, in order to support and defend our nation, which is why we want you to be able to meet the need when the time comes. Lastly, while we have a general outline of the program established, and we provided some of that information in the emails, we'd appreciate your feedback, questions, and concerns. Our intent is to adjust this program to meet your needs, so please share honestly and frequently any feedback that you have. Now I'm going to turn it over to the experts and over to our speakers today, Derek White and Paul Natopsky. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. That was very much a great intro into what this series of webinars is going to detail. So thank you, and excited to get going. So my name is Derek White. I am the Chief Product Officer and one of the co-founders of Cuick Trac and Beryllium Infosec. Been doing this since 2017, actually a little bit before that for a lot of people on our team as well. And with me today, I've got Paul Natopsky, Director of Compliance Advisory, and he's going to be joining us audio only today, but he is somebody we're going to be able to tap into his expertise and get into some of the details here in this first webinar as we sort of set up the series for what comes beyond here. And as mentioned, this is going to be a really resource-driven series throughout the summer and into the fall for defense and federal contractors, regardless of size, experience, expertise, etc. So a little bit about us real quick is we are a huge collaboration. So we have a very mission alignment with the folks at ATI, which is why we're on this series with them. Very passionate about making sure that these requirements are understood, that they're applied to the business, regardless of size and experience, like mentioned, and that there are ways to get it done. There are ways to not get it done, depending on what's most important. So with Paul Natopsky joining us today, Paul, thank you for joining. We have Paul's background is after his years in the Navy, has spent 20 plus years working on exactly what we're talking about: systems, technology, compliance, and what goes along with that, since one doesn't solve the other. And Paul has, from day one, as we get through the CMMC journey in the past, present, and future, Paul has been one of the originals on the provisional assessor list. He's a CMMC instructor, a certified professional and certified assessor. So what better resource to tap into than somebody who is training those that are going to be doing the assessments? And there's a great group of people doing that. We're going to get to some of that in future webinars, where that training aspect of not just those doing it, but what it means to your organization are very important. So thank you again for joining. Thank you for having us as well. And we're going to get right into what it's going to look like after today. So as mentioned, this is going to be a series. So we have our second webinar coming up on June 18th. We're going to get into scoping of sensitive data and why it matters. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end here. And from there, just expectation, thoughts of what we're going to get into. Everything from third-party assessors to the legal side of things, which is important for a couple different areas. Proper training and awareness, as mentioned a few minutes ago, and what audit readiness means. And it's not just a matter of reviewing what you have. It's, are you going to be able to defend yourself? Are you going to be able to explain this to somebody who's asking you the questions that need to be answered? And then there's going to be more. And the beauty of it is each session will come with free resources, So we'll point you in a direction between sessions to homework, go home, do some thinking, some applying, and come ready, fire us questions beforehand so that we can address in future webinars, which are going to feel a little bit more workshop driven than this introduction one today. So be ready for that. So today we are going to talk about the past, present, and future of CMMC. Now we know that there's a very wide net here of attendees and within the consortium, understanding CMMC and the applicable requirements there based on some of the stuff we'll talk about today comes with a huge net of understanding. It's okay if you don't understand everything. It's okay if you've never even heard of this. Some people have been doing this for years and years and years. They're looking for assurances. They're looking for direction. Maybe had a different lens on things a few years ago. So we're going to talk today about the past and what happened and how that's still today affecting the present, and what's happened recently in the present that's going to then affect the future, which is where a lot of people want to start with the future, which has got some unknowns. So we're going to uncover some of that as well. And then we're going to roll into some things that you can do in the meantime. If you have questions, please use the chat or our question and answer section. We do have some monitoring going on there throughout this presentation. So we'll have plenty of time, I think, at the end for questions. And then if you have questions after that, then we'll make sure we give you a way to channel those to us as well. So we're going to go back in time. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the past, but it is important to highlight what matters most. And in 2010, this executive order came out, and it really rescinded a 2008 executive order, but it was, we'll call one of the most important things that happened that called out this mess of data classification and what do we do with it, and if we don't handle it well and send it to who's appropriate to have it or not, then it's going to end up where it shouldn't. And so when 13556 came out, it was identifying this controlled unclassified information data set. So we're not going to go into every single detail on CUI and cover defense information and such today, but that is really the crux of what we're getting at today is if you handle that information, it's important that it's handled correctly and compliantly and securely. If you don't handle it, then that's also important, but that is the whole point of this program, is that sensitive data comes with different requirements, as it should. So then after 2010, where this was announced and discussed, the requirements took a little bit bigger shape. And in 2017, there's a lot going on in this timeline that we're not going to talk about today, all the way through the future. So we're just highlighting some big aspects here. The DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause came out, specific to regulation around and requirements around what to do if you handle controlled unclassified information. It's not just about labeling it correctly or just putting everything under scope. We're going to talk about that next time. But really, if you are going to be handling this information in non-federal systems, so not using the government stuff, that we'll call it barrier to entry is a higher standard than those that don't, and that makes sense. Theory-wise, that makes sense. So there was this deadline that was by the end of 2017. If you are subject to these requirements because you handle this information, CUI, CDI, covered technical information, for example, is another data classification, then you will have these requirements in place. And it was a trust model. It was you're going to do this because it's a requirement, and you wear hard hats at manufacturing locations. You wear goggles to protect safety. People do things because it's required. And this cybersecurity side of things was not necessarily as foundational as it should have been, because it's a topic not a lot of people had experienced, specifically back in 2010, 2017. So they put these requirements in place, and they're non-prescribed controls. So it was do what you need to do to meet these. We're not going to tell you exactly how to do it, but it's up to you to put these into place as long as they meet the requirements. And that's a good thing versus a heavy playbook of things that aren't possible for a smaller company versus, say, an enterprise company that there's more resources, but the challenges are still the same. It's how do you do this? And so back then, what we heard and this is important kind of as we go through this timeline, what we heard at that point was things like, hey, supposedly we're supposed to put these things into place. There's FAR clause, other language and stuff out there that are in pretty much every contract, that this DFARS related stuff kind of just got thrown into the mix and not really jumped into. And part of it was kind of how it was worded, is that when we say, okay, well, yeah, you need to do this stuff, but what is it that you're worried about? Well, it looks like we need a gap assessment against the controls of NIST standard 171. We need a system security plan to talk about how we do it. And then we have a plan of action and milestones for those gaps that we aren't doing, but we're going to do them. And there were resources back then that were available. We were very integrated with some of those, manufacturing extension partnership, the MVP program, some other associations. And although good in nature, not a ton of experience and expertise there to give back to these contractors that are kind of looking at this as just a check the box program. And so as it reads, it became more of a, if you have this, then you're going to be working on it. And that was the trust model. There was no way to really verify that. And we heard a lot of quotes like, well, we have a plan, we're making progress. That's all my customers really asking for. So as long as I'm making progress, then POAMs are allowed. My system security plan is decent, and I'll worry about this later. Well, you fast forward from there, and 2019 comes around, and you could feel this coming if you've been working with defense contractors or the federal contracting space from 2017 and prior. Something's coming. There's a seismic shift coming on how the DoD specifically in this case is going to monitor this, how they're going to take it upon their own requirements to make sure that their supply chain is going to be secure, so that CUI, which is not classified yet, not basic information, that is not living in federal systems, is protected and safeguarded. Well, CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, comes out and announced with a very pomp and circumstance program. And honestly, it worked, but it is a validation of the requirements. So CMMC is not new controls, new requirements, new programs, so to speak. We're going to have third parties be trained up. Everyone's going to be working from the same playbook, and they're going to come in and assess you. The government's not going to do it. These certified third-party assessors are going to come in. They're going to make sure that your stuff is in place. Well, that in theory sounds amazing, except of course the conversation then becomes, well, how does that happen? And right, wrong, or indifferent, the way they rolled it out in 2019 was very adventurous. We'll put it at that. It's going to take some time to put something like that in place, right? So at that point, we had people freaking out saying, we have to get certified now. And I said, okay, tell me about where you're at. We've been doing this for years. Well, we just need our policy and procedures because we have everything else in place. That's a very open-ended comment. And some people were in great shape, some weren't. And that isn't something that you just dust off. You're not going to pass anything if you're just dusting off documentation. Other things we heard is our MSPs got us, so we don't manage any of our technology, so it's all on them. It's not, because it's not just a technical solve. Same with going up into the cloud, migrating to the cloud, so that your costs might be lower on your infrastructure, but your responsibility is then shifted to where is that data? And we're not going to spend a ton of time going into what that means, because that's another conversation that we'll get into with these future webinars. But a lot of this feeling of this shouldn't be that much more than what I'm doing. I just have to have it documented better in order to pass an assessment. So then we'd say, okay, well, cool. Tell me about what you have. Tell me about your MSP. Tell me about your cloud provider, your internal team. How is that managed? And what does it look like on a responsibility matrix? And then people were, what's a responsibility matrix? What's an inheritance matrix? And so, still a huge gap on announcement of a program like CMMC to then what happens from here. So after 2019, the hubbub and the dust kind of settled on this new program, this certification, where everybody was like, oh man, this is going to be huge and important. What I will call personally is the biggest accountability shift to the supply chain of the DoD was something called the DFARS interim rule in 2020. So this was COVID had hit. This is the end of the COVID year. People are working virtually. Things changed. And so the DoD, in a way, if you want to look at it this way, came up with a bridge solution. This has nothing to do with CMMC, okay? DFAR's interim rule was an extension, really, of the 7012 requirements. So the DoD had to look at their supply chain, say, how do we make it so that we get this program rolled out, this CMMC program rolled out, but that we're not backlogging a lot of problems at that point? It's going to take us some time. Well, they made it a requirement that if you have the requirements of DFAR 7012, that you then now have a requirement of 7019 and 7020. Not to acronym everybody to death here, but we can't do every single detail here. You're going to self-assess yourself against the requirements of NIST 800-171, using what the DoD's assessment methodology is, which is to use the assessment guide called NIST 800-171A. And you're going to get into the details of what an assessor is looking for, and you're going to score yourself appropriately by removing a score number down if you can't demonstrate it with evidence, with true evidence to what it is. And you're also going to be ready for a government-led assessment, and they can ask anything they want, show up, and dig into whatever they want to. But more importantly, you're going to score yourself. You're going to put that score into a government system that can be relied upon and referenced back to in the future. That's a very huge step. So now it's not just checking a box on a questionnaire from your customer and going through that whole deal of, yes, we're good, no one's going to ask me. Now they can ask you later and say, but your score said that. Then we saw a huge spike in, we want our score, we want it now. And it'll explain this to me more. What does it mean? And there's 5 or 6 questions you can ask right away. We're going to get to some of these later on taking the temperature pulse check at that point on if someone's actually ready or not. There's 320 assessment objectives, for example, not 110 controls, but there's actually assessment objectives that have to be mapped and demonstrated through evidence and interviewing and et cetera to pass an assessment on those controls. Huge shift, right? Everyone was like, it says basic self-assessment, so I'm just going to assess myself, get a score, get it into the system, because that's the requirement. Doesn't matter what the score is. Good intentions, backlog of self-confidence that really wasn't truthful in some cases. People are busy. They got other stuff going on. And so a lot of compliance tools. So we bought a compliance tool. We have all of our evidence. It builds our documentation for us. So we're in pretty good shape for now. So we're going to see what happens. That was what we heard a lot of. And to a lot of people's credit, they sat up straight when this interim rule came out and started to pay attention to things that weren't really on the radar before. So from there, the CMMC rule got proposed, fast forwarding to the end of last year, some big hurdles were overstepped. The rulemaking process, which we're not going to spend an hour talking about that today, because that's more than an hour conversation. Things took a little bit more form at the end of 2023, and the rule-making process for DFAR 7021, which is the requirement that CMMC is in contracts to validate that suppliers have their stuff in order, got moved through to the Office of Management and Budget, and then that rulemaking process clock started to tick. At that point, again, another surge in, well, we need to get certified right now, which you can't, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And I'm getting these questionnaires, and they're confusing. What do I do? I've been frustrated working with whoever for the last couple of years. All valid concerns, and that's what this whole series is going to be about as we get into the future. So what happened recently in the present, as we go on to the future here, some really big things happened in the last couple of weeks, kind of oddly happening at the same time, but clearly on purpose. So I'm going to let Paul talk here a little bit about a deviation to the DFAR 7012 and how that impacts things like a new revision of NIST 800-171. Rev 3 is out in draft, and that will be something that in the future, a little ways down the road, will be very important to contractors, but also the 48 CFR rule ending up in the OMB office for review. That happened, all this has happened within the last couple of weeks. Paul, do you want to touch on that for just a minute or two before we roll on to the next few slides?
Sure. Thanks, Derek. I apologize for being on audio only. Hopefully audio is okay with you guys. But very, very interesting. I like the timeline, a good overview of all the dates and all the important things going on. But like you said, as we move into the future, what's happening to us? So you called out that DFAR 7012 class deviation. So what that was talking about was stating, if we went back to the 7012 rule itself, that stated that the companies needed to implement a program from the standard 171. Really, what they had in the background was, you'll use the most recent version of NIST Standard 171 at the time of solicitation and award. So what this is stating is, hey, the class deviation saying we're going to lock down on this NIST 800-171 Rev 2, because that's really what that CMMC proposed rule is calling out, that 7021 rule. And that is being passed through the 32 Code of Federal Regulations. So that's all for national defense. And they want to make sure that those two align, that there's no conflicts in those. So we could see that, in the future, 5-10 years down the line, as there are updates to CMMC, then they'll have to make sure that the 7012 and 7021 rules are starting to match up. So I think that was pretty smart of them to do, especially right before revision 3 got proposed, or I guess finalized and published out there. It doesn't mean that you should obviously wait until the end before you start looking into Rev 3, but as far right now, what you need to put in place is still going to be 800-171 revision 2. So it's definitely good to have out there. And that 48 CFR rule that you mentioned, that one's for acquisition. So it's going to be paired up with that DFARS 7021 rule, because that's just for like the national defense program to get established. And now with the 48 CFR rule going together, that's going to tell the government that they have to start putting that into contracts. So really good, a lot of good stuff going on. And we hope that people are at least getting more educated in this. As you can see, like all of these rules are building upon each other. It's not like one of these can live without the previous one. So we can anticipate that maybe in the future we'll have some additional rules that might come out as well to help build upon these.
Yeah, for sure. And that, that's hitting on why we wanted to really highlight that in red on today, even though the present on this slide is everything that matters today. The stuff that you have to defend yourself on now. You want to be accurate, but you want to be confident so that your customer, maybe it's a new opportunity that you can demonstrate that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing now, but you are readying yourself so that you can meet these future requirements. And there was a lot of concerns for those that follow along in the rulemaking process on how these things are all this huge idea of third-party certifications. That'll do it. Just how they intertwine with each other. Those streams have to come together to make sure that this stuff gets done. Based on what the requirements in your contracts are going to say. Nobody wants a mess of confusion. So from here, that's the stuff though that gets into the future, and we can't sit here and talk about every single detail of the future because stuff has to take shape. Dominoes have to fall in the way they have to fall. And as Paul just highlighted, one of those big things is what you can do now. There's a lot of noise out there of all these things you can be doing, but it's really geared at everybody. One to everybody approach is not how this was intended to be. Everybody's situation is different. Every business has different processes in place, different maturities in place, and different systems, different ways they access and store data, and on and on and on, right? So that allows us to here kind of transition into what's coming, but how does that impact you today, so that this webinar series is something that you can leave with helpful resources and things to do and start to realign your focus if you need to, or continue on the great path that you're on, or maybe learn about some ways that are more affordable, that are better to manage because you maybe don't have to take on as much responsibility, or maybe you think you have a ton of responsibility outsourced and you have to make sure that that's going to be the same results and answers from your assessment team that comes in someday. So right now it's scope of CUI. Talk about that here in a couple minutes so that we can talk about future webinars. Your NIST Standard 171 program needs to be fully implemented in order to pass a CMMC level 2 assessment. So we'll talk a little bit about what level 1, level 2, and level 3 mean from a CMMC perspective for those that don't have a full understanding of that yet. which is fine. And, what the compliance side of things mean versus just technology, infrastructure, and implementation costs are. So that's different than an assessment cost. So we want to make sure we separate those two conversations. And you want to make, anytime you have a third party or something that's literally related to time, you want that to be efficient. So everyone's used consultants, right? Everyone has lawyers or consultants, doesn't matter. You want everything that you need to have ready condensed to make things efficient. And that's what the C3PAOs want. The ones that are out there to do this, to make sure that our supply chain gets secured as fast as possible, are looking for that type of information first before they even tell you how much time it's going to take. And we're going to talk about that too. So one of the big things on that, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is properly scoping your security protection assets, which is something that got released in some of the drafts, some of the models, that has a lot more focus on it than it might have in the past, and how that you put that into your scoping diagrams and how you're going to prepare. So we're going to talk about that too. Experience right now is key. What does a system security plan look like? Has it been reviewed by somebody who knows what it should be based on your responsibility matrix, your shared responsibility matrix, which is what the SRM abbreviation is there for, because that's all going to map together on the questions that matter for your assessment. So we want to talk about that. So lastly, on the future, what's coming, no one knows exactly how the award certification award process is going to go. We have a pretty good idea. They're still working out some details there. Less focus on that, more focus on today, and what impacts certification, how they're done is going to be all about the stuff we're going to talk about for this whole series anyway. So if you have questions on that, we're happy to do it, because our big focus here is going to be believing versus knowing. Over our about 7+ years now, a lot of belief, a lot less knowing on the early days. It's getting better. And there are just certain things. There are really key components that we're going to focus on next session. And after that, you have to know that stuff. If you don't know it, you can't make the decisions now that are going to be very impactful in the future. And nobody wants to show up to their certification believing that they're good. That's going to be a very emotional conversation if a step or 5 or 6 were missed early in the process. So we're really going to highlight that as we get into the rest of today and then into our next session. So from here, there's lots of questions, and we know that, and we're monitoring them here over on the side. So questions you may be asking yourself, and questions are good, by the way. You want to be asking questions. You want to be thinking through things with the right details. The first question, Paul, I'm going to let you answer some of these. I've been doing too much talking. So how do I know if I'm going to need CMMC level 1 versus level 2?
That's a good question. I think that's something that everyone is wondering about right now. I guess you could even pair into their level 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you should know by the contract. Remember, anytime you're going through a solicitation from the government, is that they're supposed to be telling you this information beforehand as you're going in for the bidding process. So within the contract, you should have that DFAR 7021 clause, and that there should be some additional information there stating that you will be required to go out and get a CMMC level, or do a level 1 self-assessment, do a level 2 self-assessment, do a level 2 assessment from a C3PAO, or get a level 3 assessment with the C3PAO and DCMA DIBCAC. So it needs to be communicated to you through your contract.
Mm-hmm. And and that's well said. And I know we're already getting questions on this topic, so this is timely. But there used to be a 5-level model when CMMC was first announced. So if anybody's talking to you about 5 levels, that's a good indicator that you probably want to stop talking to them. They're probably new to the space, and that's dangerous. But level 1, level 2, and level 3, it was built this way so that, if you have basic safeguarding requirements of information that's not as sensitive as, say, CUI and CDI, et cetera, then you don't have to meet those same requirements at level 2. If level 2 is the kind of the baseline for handling that data, we still need it above and beyond. And that's what level 3 is. It's a more proactive way of keeping, say, your level 2, your NIST Standard 171 program in place, where the threats to the data are more sophisticated, and they're going to continuously evolve across all of these these requirements, but level 3 is a more proactive approach. That's going to be far and few between out of the gate. But that's the important side of understanding your data and your scope and working with your customer on where are you going to fall on that list based on the data that you handle. So more on that to come. But thank you, Paul, for answering that. Another very common question that I'm sure people are asking too is, what if I have the DFARS 7012 contract clause in my contract or solicitations and I don't make or create CUI?
That's great. I think that question comes up a lot, not even just in the contracts, but sometimes through purchase orders or terms and conditions or elsewhere that's been communicated to the company that they have to adhere to the 7021 clause, or excuse me, the 7010-12 clause. Really what you should do is communicate with whoever issued that order to you. And get an understanding like what type of information are you sharing with us that's going to be covered defense information, or get some specifications on what it is that you're going to be creating that may be CUI. That's really just like an indicator that you may or have some sort of involvement with CUI. If you don't have any of it, then it is something that you should probably ask them to remove, because there's other clauses that would get inserted in there, such as if you're a COTS provider, a commercial off-the-shelf provider, and that way they can get commercial determination of the product or service that you're offering, so they can apply the proper clauses to you.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, there was a little bit of a glitch there with Zoom, so apologies for that. I do want to disclaim real quick that if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer section if you can, versus the webinar chat. It's just easier to navigate that from our side. So please see that I can see that there's both going on. So yes, thank you, Paul. So moving on here so that we can get through on to the next section here is, what if I'm a prime? That comes up a lot too. You know, primes aren't just these huge enterprise companies, but primes can be of different shapes and sizes. What is the impact there, Paul, for what they should be thinking about now so that they can get ready for the future?
Yeah, I think kind of back with the question right above it is about communicating the. The question before was about you as the recipient. Now we're at the prime. So a prime, you should only be flowing down these clauses if it's going to be required. If you're going to be sharing covered defense information, if you're going to be sharing some sort of other covered information with these companies, don't just do like these blanket agreements with your subcontractors, including every single clause that may or may not apply. Also, you likely want to ensure that the contractors or subcontractors are aware of what CMMC is, that it's a future requirement, not necessarily something you have to get certification for now, and to give them assurance that the 7012 clause is going to be applicable. Maybe talk to them, figuring out like what the communication plan is, like how are you going to be sharing CUI or CDI? That way it's very clear on what protection measures will likely need to be put in place as the subs and the primes are trying to do like their scoping exercises and such.
Yeah,
so training and education and communications are always key.
Yeah, and the visibility downstream has been, I think this goes without saying, challenging over the years. So there is a lot of responsibility on primes on who you're procuring business to, and that's something we're going to get into on contract review, scoping stuff as we continue on. Another one that comes up all the time too is, what if I receive a flow down and no one can explain to me what my CUI is? You just mentioned that a little bit, Paul. We have highlighted something like the NARA CUI registry. That's one area. What are some other things, or another thing that they can do now that will help them kind of frame up where we're going to go with these future webinars on that topic alone?
Yeah, I don't remember if you provided this as a resource, but you guys do have like a white paper that highlights this stuff too. But some areas that you should be looking through in the contract, again, the terms and conditions of a purchase order, the purchase order itself, look at the contract, the statement of work, DD 254, security classification guide, or even any of the procedurals, the contract data requirements list. Those documents themselves should be specifying what you as an organization will be creating that is going to be considered covered defense information, control technical information, or CUI. So that's really like the main items to go look at. If it hasn't been communicated through those means, then going back to whoever issued that document to you, the purchase order or the contract, to get clarification from the contracting officer or their knowledge operators on what it is that you guys will be creating that CUI.
Yes, and the reference to that resource is coming up here in a second. We've got a few more that we're going to point to as well. So thank you for highlighting that. I do apologize. This animated GIF was supposed to stop. So if anybody's hypnotized by this graphic, I apologize for that. Yes, moving on to the last question here on just things we wanted to highlight. So is everything associated with my contract needing the same protections? We touched on this a little bit, but can you dive a little deeper on that, Paul, before we move on?
Sure. I guess maybe I should let off the series of answers with little disclaimers that, at any time you do have these questions, obviously seek out like your legal advisor, your legal counsel, so they can work it out with the contracting officers. But here, is everything associated with my contract needing the same protections? I would say no. It's really going to be the covered defense information that requires this protection. The caveat to that would be is if it's a mixed environment. So maybe you have your company's intellectual property plus CUI on the same information systems. Well, those information systems need that protection, but the data itself can have different protection measures. Like if you're going to email it out, maybe your company doesn't care if you encrypt the information, but for covered defense information, yes, it has to be encrypted or protected. Also, it's going to go back to who actually owns the information, going back to, again, legal counsel, data rights, ownership, and such, in which some types of information can remain in two states. So it could be both your company's intellectual property as well as covered defense information, but it depends on when it's exchanged hands. So sometimes information requires it until it gets delivered to the government, and then they will have to protect it. So it's a little bit of a challenge to answer that one very clearly, but it all depends.
Yeah. Yes, that's good. That's a good segue into where we're going to go from here. So the next, before we get to some of the resources that we're going to point to right now, a little preview of what webinar 2 is going to look like. So I want to make sure that we get to enough time for question and answer here today. So June 18th, 2 p.m. Eastern time, you'll get invites out here from the ATI team that we will be diving a little bit more into the details. So we're going to start where you should always start, is scoping and why that matters, why it's important. So Paul, you're going to walk through a scoping exercise. We have an example of a diagram up here on which might look super complicated to some, but or it's going to look great to others who say, "Oh, I want to apply something like this." Real quick, maybe 2-3 minutes on some of the things that people can expect when we walk through what that looks like and how it's addressed and how we're working with people on the scoping side, for example, and others, and why that's important.
Yeah, I definitely like this diagram from the CMMC Center of Awesomeness. I know you're going to give them some kudos later on, but yeah, this gives you like a really good outline of what you should be thinking about when you're talking about scoping. Usually when we go through scoping exercises, we do 2 things right before this. First, we review contracts. We want to see what type of information is being communicated to you that is going to be considered covered defense information. And then the second one, we try to figure out business process flows. So trying to figure out how your company's interacting with that data, so we know like what information systems, what people, and what locations it's being accessed by. And then you start digging into it. Okay, well, who owns like this information system? Is it us as a company? Do we have a third party that provides services for it? And then we start putting into like these zones. So here we have our major zone, which could be like an enterprise environment, or maybe you segment it off. That's in that little yellow bubble there. And this is where you're going to be putting all of that cover defense information. And we look at the types of tools that interact with that cover defense information. And this is something that was really highlighted during CMMC's rulemaking process and stuff. They came out with like security protected assets. And these are tools like your SIM tool or your logging tool. It could be your identity provider, such as Active Directory and whatnot. So we put those into another zone. Just so we highlight that, yes, we don't have a CUI here, but it provides security measures of our CUI. So we still have to apply security measures to those tools. Then we start looking at any interconnections. So we could have interconnections between our own systems. So if we did have this segmented off, into a small environment, and maybe our headquarters organization has some sort of direct feed into it, that's still a direct connection or external connection to the system. So we put those into a zone as well. And obviously, since we have our security tools that are connected to the CUI, those security tools may have connections out. So we look at those, make sure that we're either providing some sort of security protections like firewall rules and such, or ensuring that data doesn't flow easily between the two. And then the last, it would be the out of scope assets, which would have like a virtual or physical segmentation from them. So this, we start drawing out that picture because this is how we want to start structuring policy, and policy should follow essentially our architecture for the system. And then I guess we jump out a little bit too into the supply chain. So how are we interacting with vendors, colleagues and such outside? Are we emailing them, sharing things through like a SharePoint or other portals? Because that's going to dictate how we write policies and how we're allowed to share information with them. Plus, we want to go back to contracts and make sure we're communicating to those parties that they have the same obligations as us if they have covered defense information.
Yeah, well said. And walking through that's exactly how the next webinar is going to go. So lots of shift coming potentially in the future when certifications are being handed out, right? To start thinking about where can you put responsibility where you can't, and how that impacts your scope is everything. So just because somebody says, even though not your responsibility, hey, send us this information compliantly to our system, go into here and do it, that's one step. And there's implications there on what happens if they tell you that that's not how it's going to be anymore. And what are they? You have the right to ask questions. And I know we're getting a ton of questions on some stuff here that we're going to get to in a second. So those are all great topics. And that's why we are going to take things into a more workshop feel moving forward. So between now and then, there are things that we are encouraging everyone here today and those that are going to attend the next set of webinars, but specifically before the second one on June 18th. There are some things that you can do now that really just cost you your own time. And if you're here, then you're probably thinking, okay, so what can I go from today and where do I go? First thing, Paul already mentioned this. We have an ebook that's available for free on our website. We're not a big fan of hiding behind paywalls or info walls and such, but this is a free resource that gets into a lot of what Paul was just talking about. That's the kind of the starting of the knowing side that we were talking about before. So that's a huge step in the right direction, and you probably are going to have questions on it. That's great. Second resource we can drive you to, and yes, the slides will be available, by the way, and we'll have a link at the end too that you can access these at any time. So these links will be live, so you can also go right to them from there. The second thing, as mentioned a little bit ago, was the CMMC Center of Awesomeness. So first off, there's a warning. There's some mature language on there. It's a little more tongue in cheek, but this website was put together years ago by a lot of people in this industry, which we're involved with, that really do care. And that sounds cheesy, but it's so true. They care about the things that matter most. And so this pool of knowledge base put out a website that has spreadsheets and scoping diagrams and explanations, very wordy, but it's truthful and it's written with some attitude, not gonna lie, but it is a great resource that we'll direct you guys to, and expect you to have questions on that too. So just know that there is an update coming to this because of NIST under 171 Rev 3, which I know we have a lot of questions on, and we'll get back to that in a second on Rev 2 versus Rev 3. So there is a big update coming, so that's cool. So just know that if you download anything now between that and the update, you'll probably have to go back in and re-pull it down. Again, warning on language. It's meant in good spirits, but it is a great resource. We are huge fans of stuff that's already available by experts who know what they're talking about that can help you get going in the direction you want to go or validate things that you've already been working on. The second thing is reach out. So we don't charge people to talk to us. And right now, the last 12 to 18 months, specifically the last 6 months, a lot of people are looking for pulse checks and sanity checks on their current plan. So a lot of people got after it, and as they should, and they're doing really well. There's just a couple things that change, and there are some language and things that are in the requirements and stuff that have to be further defined still that will impact some stuff. So you should know what those are. And so reach out to us. We'll have a contact information here at the end, and we'll talk. Our team's happy to talk to you and see if we can help set you on a good path or introduce you to the right people or right resources or schedule time to talk further. So please do that. The ATI team, obviously huge resource as well. Reach out to them. Happy to support however we can. A big piece and a big action between now and then the warning comes back here because there is a tab on here that is the scoping diagram that we just referenced on the last slide. That is a great exercise to go through if you're feeling a little paralyzed, which is absolutely natural, to just think through your data flows. I know we've got some questions already about how do we decide this, or how do we determine if somebody should or shouldn't, or something should or shouldn't handle this information. That's not always the easiest answer, but there's ways to think through who needs to be in scope and who doesn't. The smaller the scope, the easier it is to wrap the controls around it. But that's not just because it's taking people out of the scope to make things more affordable is the best approach to your business. You still have to deliver your product. So start thinking through how do contracts come in? Where does that data go? What do we do with it? And what are we making? What are we delivering here? And I know we've got questions on that too. Is what I'm delivering CUI? And that's the conversation for later. But there are going to be moments where you're going to ask that question in is it CUI or not? And Paul already touched on that, and that's a huge topic, and we want to be able to point you in the right direction. So with that, we have a few minutes left here. It looks like 13 minutes left here to get through some questions. I'm going to fire some of them up here real quick. There's a QR code on the screen. If you're near a screen, scan that. That'll bring you to a website from ATI that has future schedule, resources from today, the slides, etc. But again, there's 2 email addresses on here. Send one to ATI, send one to us. Mention this webinar so that we know where you're coming from, and let's chat and see what we can do to help. So thanks for let's get through some of that stuff here, but we're going to spend the remaining time getting through some questions. So Paul, not to hot potato you here, but I'm going to tee up a couple. I do think we need to go back to, because I see a bunch of questions here on the Rev 3 versus the Rev 2. So I think maybe the question here is, should I be focused on Rev 2 for now under 2.0, CMMC 2.0? And then when should I start focusing on revision 3 of NIST 171? Can we retouch on that for a couple minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now the requirement is NIST 171 revision 2, as communicated through the DFAR 7012 clause with a class deviation. And when we look at the 7021 clause, we see that that's CMMC 2.11 that's in the rulemaking process right now. And all of that is referring over to NIST 171 revision 2. So the focus definitely needs to be on revision 2. When revision 3 will come out, that's to be determined. Obviously, it's going to have to go through rulemaking because of the class deviation and the 7021 clause is communicating Rev 2 as the version. So I think the earliest that we could anticipate it would be, I'd guess, 2 years, because that's really what the rulemaking process has been taking for CMMC. I think in reality, I would probably make it a little bit longer, 3-4 years out, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the we'll say the encouraging thing of revision 3 is the language in there does seem to be more NIST 853 written. And we'll just say the interpretations of that should make things better. It really should. It may seem a little confusing at first in some areas, but it does have good intentions. It will in the long run be a better outcome as far as we're concerned. So yes, the answer to that is revision 2 is your Bible right now, NIST 171A as your assessment guide for doing that, so that when the day of CMMC certification is in contracts, that's what they're going to be assessing you on. If you don't see a requirement for a certification until even further down the road where Rev 3 is closer, then that means you're not handling CUI or whatever the prioritization of the CMMC rollout is going to be. Then you have time and you have similar steps in how you can prepare for that. You can do gap assessment against your current infrastructure. If you have end of life equipment or new changes that you're going to make, maybe you are going to migrate to the cloud or something like that, then that stuff all comes into play, and you'll be able to demonstrate your plan and talk about what you're going to be doing in order to meet the Rev 3 requirements, as Paul just said, once they're in the requirement phase, which is going to be down the road a little bit. I do have one question. I think it's one came up a couple times, and I do want to put this out there that we did get a couple questions around costs, and it does seem like small businesses are being strong armed or forced out, I think was maybe one of the quotes that was used here. But the cost of business to work with the DoD specifically and in other agencies that are going to adopt a similar model around cybersecurity requirements and information security requirements has gone up significantly in the last 10 years. And it's hard to talk through some of that when not everybody's contracts are lucrative, right? It's a big portion of their business. They like it, they want to grow it, they want to deliver on it. So we feel you on that. And the cost of certification, so the actual cost of hiring somebody to come in and spend time to validate whether you're doing it or not, is a little hard to predict because the model is currently built so that the market dictates price. And right now it's going to be expensive because there's not a plethora of C3PAOs with this huge availability. It's still very limited in the large scheme of things, and it's going to be for a little bit. So, but budgeting in that cost is going to be an additional cost. So yes, there are some decisions to be made on what your defense and federal contract business looks like to make sure you allocate resources correctly, and can you put it in your contracts, all that kind of stuff. We totally get, and we're happy to point you in the right direction, have conversations with you on that and how that impacts your business. Another question, I'll just get this out of the way. Acronyms, yes, apologies. This is a very difficult space and difficult conversation and presentation to not have acronyms because the government loves them. And so we can put together a glossary of terms, and I'm sure we can add that to the ATI website that's at the bottom here for everyone to reference. And then if you do have questions on what those mean, obviously, again, we can reach out. Let's see, let's go into the Paul, tons of experience on this. So a lot of questions around what I just touched on a second ago on things like lawful government purpose, CUI handling, not just from like how do we handle it, but how do we determine who can and should and shouldn't? What are some best practice, some things right now that people can apply between now and the next webinar when they want to talk further with us, that you can point people to on thought process, on scope of individuals? We'll start with that on handling CUI.
Yeah, absolutely. In typical terms, like when we're going through NIST Standard 171, we want to apply the principle of least privilege. So is it somebody that's actually going to be working on the contract? If not, then they don't need access to it. They don't really have a lawful government purpose. Lawful government purpose means that they're going to be working on the contract. They have some reason. Business usually dictates the reason for them working on it. Doesn't matter if they're doing administrative tasks. Could be your cleaning crew too. That has a lawful government purpose because they have to go in and maintain the areas, or if you have to share the information with external parties, that could all be covered under the grounds of a lawful government purpose. Again, it goes back to like scoping at the beginning. What information you're receiving, how is the company going to be working with it, who are they sharing it with, and then those individuals would likely be the ones that have a lawful government purpose that need to work with it. The information shouldn't just be on some share drive that everybody has access to. You need to control access to it, just like you would for personnel records within the organization. Maybe you have budgeting information that you don't want all the employees to know about. These are all things that you have some sort of constraints around, and you give people access to it based off of their job role or their duties.
Mhm. Yes, and that first off, that's an amazing question, and thank you for the answer, Paul, because that really tees up what webinar number 2 is going to be about on that scope side. And it's not just technology. And that's another thing that over the years, it's easy. I mean, everyone is raised the same way. We always joke about this. Everyone's been raised the same way when it comes to technology, right? And there was days where email, holy cow, this is amazing, or this blue link. What does that mean? Where does that? Oh my gosh, it sends me right to where this person wants me to go. And that evolvement of not thinking about how that impacts what used to be a room with file cabinets and physical information is important now in this digital age, now that a lot of people are on the remote side. So information is information. That's another thing that we're going to make sure we talk about. That is a thing data? That's another question that comes up. Is this thing CUI? And Paul is we spend so much time on this with customers. There's a lot of good questions that we can equip you with as well to go back to your customer or contracting officer or your legal team on making sure that gets defined properly, because that will impact your costs, that will impact your scope, that will impact what type of systems from a technology side you do have to work with. But technology isn't everything. There is policy and procedures. There is documentation that is outlining how you handle it when technology is not responsible for keeping it secure. And that's security. Or compliance side is the other side of it, right? So a lot of resources out there that can get very, very confusing. I know we're coming up at the end of time here, but we've had a couple questions about, is there a list of people a list of companies that are certified already to be C3PAOs? Yes. Word of advice here is another reason that we're doing this topic next on scoping is for a lot of conversations we start with and over the years have been, we're ready. Okay, so we have everything gathered. We've been working on this, and we say, okay, what they're going to ask you, the C3PAOs, these certified third-party assessment organizations, and the certified assessors are going to ask you questions like, what does your scoping diagram look like? Do you have a network diagram? Do you have a system security plan that reflects those things and other things? Do you have documentation written for policy? And they're going to ask you stuff like that. And if you say, yeah, I think we're good, but we need help with that, in the CMMC world, and we're ready to be certifying contractors, if you don't have answers to that, they're going to tell you you're not ready. You don't really want to show up to that saying you are ready when you're not, because it costs just as much to go through that and find out that you believe that you were instead of knowing that you were. And a lot of people are trying to capitalize on that right now. Again, after some of these more recent updates, specifically at the end of last year and into some of the recent updates to requirements and rulemaking process. It's kind of like a twilight zone, back to gap assessment. Make sure if you don't have some of that stuff, that's okay. Then that's what we're doing this webinar series for. You don't want to start too far ahead, because you can really, really capture some valuable aspects now versus waiting down the road. So I know it's a little open-ended response there, but don't worry, we'll get there. And you can't get certified right now. So if this is a newer education series for you, and this is something that you're trying to figure out if you want to go into this realm, or it's never been something that's been asked and you're not even sure by your contract language if this applies to you, you can't get certified, and you won't be able to for a while yet. So the CMMC rulemaking process is, like Paul said, probably the end of next year. That's okay. Don't wait for that, because at that point you're walking up to the gates and you're saying, I'm good to go. It's a long ways to go before you walk up to the gate. So that'll be the best part of some of these webinar series. We're going to have different resources on here where we focus on training, the legal side, some of these things that we can point you to, make introductions to, and it should be really, really, really valuable, I think, for especially those on the small to medium size, or those that just don't have resources to have a full staff focus on this stuff day to day. I think we're at time, so this might be a good place to stop. One last thing I'll say, because this works really well with other webinar series like this, but if you've got questions that you want us to tackle on the next webinar when we're talking about scoping and how it applies and why it matters, please send those to ATI or send those to us, and we'll get them in there. So there's questions on here we didn't answer, so we'll try to go through these too, and maybe send out a response to questions that we can reference answers to, because it's not always just our answer. It's going to be where that answer lives. Get that over to everybody. And again, thank you for joining and for going through this more introductory first one, so that we can get into the brass tacks on the rest of them, and hopefully everybody gets some really, really good outcomes from this, and good takeaways. So from here, I'm going to kick it back to the ATI team, because I want to make sure that we leave everybody the appropriate way.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for joining. The slides will be posted as well as recording on the same link. So if you bookmark that, it'll be up there shortly. Again, thank you, and look forward to seeing everybody in our next session.
Thank you.